CJ, it's time for us to look at teams in the playoff picture at American Thanksgiving. We've just called it this unofficial marker for whether or not teams will be able to make it. If they're in that spot at that time, why not lean into it and make a whole game out of it? Contenders and pretenders. Essentially, it's this. I get it, CJ. You're shaking your head. You don't like this. For those contenders and pretenders, it's not saying that if you're a contender, you're going to win the Stanley Cup. It's really just if you're going to be in a playoff position at the end of the season when it comes time. It was just a really catchy term I tried to come up with, and contenders and pretenders was just the thing I came up with.
Can I first just say one thing?
Sure, go ahead.
The season starts a week later now, so we even have a week less data than we once would have at American Thanksgiving. So we are flying, not even for most teams are nowhere near 20 games yet into the season. So these are ridiculously early judgments, but I will play along because I like you, my friend.
I like you too. Let's start with the Eastern Conference.
Mm-hmm.
How about the Boston Bruins? Atop the Atlantic Division, 14 wins, 31 points. Contender or pretender?
Screaming home run of a contender. That one's easy, I think. I still can't quite put my mind around why that's happening. How the Bruins have kept where they've kept with some of the players they've lost in recent years, and they just don't seem to skip a beat. But I am very comfortable calling them a contender in this case, not just for the playoffs, of course, but for the mug, depending on what kind of season they can have and what kind of maybe moves that Don Sweeney can make as the year goes along.
Also in the Atlantic, let's stay there for a bit. The Florida Panthers.
Contender.
That's just it? You don't have any fun other description of the Florida Panthers?
Well, I mean, they were in the Cup final last year. They've weathered injuries to Ekblad and Montour, who have returned to their lineup. Sam Reinhart's having a great year. It's contract year, by the way. We haven't talked about that. But I don't see any reason why they won't be a factor once again as the season goes on. So I see them as absolute playoff contenders.
This next team looks like they'll have Andrei Vasilevsky back in the fold sooner rather than later. The Tampa Bay Lightning.
You would look dumb if you ever called them a pretender. I'm going to stick with contender there in Tampa. I mean, the window of opportunity is likely slowly closing in Tampa just with the age of their core players and some things that they're facing. But this is not the year where I'm going to say it's closed. They're still a contender.
Let's go to the other top three teams in the Eastern Conference, this time through the Metro. The New York Rangers.
Contender.
Okay. The Washington Capitals.
Ooh. They're a surprise for me. I mean, look, they got off to a slow start initially out of the gate. They've roared back to life here. I'm going to give them my first pretender. I still think it's going to be a tough year for the Caps to make the playoffs.
And right now they are tied on points with the Carolina Hurricanes.
And so you want me to say Carolina?
Pretender? Contender?
Carolina's a contender. Bit of a slow start by their standards of the last few seasons, but I don't see any real grave cause for concern in Carolina. So I think they're very much a firm contender playoff team.
Okay, let's get to the wildcard teams. The Toronto Maple Leafs.
They're a contender. Don't have when we say a lot about the Leafs on the show, don't have a lot to add.
We do
to what's gone on, up and down start to the year, but I mean their top players are all firing at a pretty high level, and I don't see missing the playoffs as something that's in their future this year.
The Detroit Red Wings.
I'm back and forth on this one. I'll be honest. I think they're a pretender. I mean, they're definitely better than where they've been. Well, really, this is why I don't like the moniker, because I don't mean that they're a terrible team by any stretch. No. I don't see them making the playoffs is kind of what I'm saying here. So for the purposes of the game and to have a rhyming one or the other, I guess in the context of this game, it's a pretender, but I don't think they're quite there yet myself. And there's a lot of good teams around them. I mean, look, you haven't mentioned a few yet that I think are pretty established teams. And so there's not room for everybody to make it. And so I don't think Washington makes it among the teams in there. And I don't think Detroit makes it.
I'm very curious about what you think with this next team that is tied on points with the Detroit Red Wings, The Philadelphia Flyers.
Pretender. I mean, credit where it's due. They look really good. And so maybe they are a team that just jumped up way ahead of the schedule I would have put them on or thought they were on. But, I still think a team like New Jersey, who you haven't mentioned yet, rather, is going to get in there. And I would put them as a contender team, even though it hasn't looked great. And I know Lindy Ruff was pretty candid with his assessment of their play, in particular on Wednesday night. But I'm gonna say for now the Flyers remain a pretender.
So I'm glad you mentioned them because you have the Islanders who are out of a playoff spot right now. The Penguins are out of a playoff spot right now. The Devils, you're absolutely right, also out of a playoff spot. Would you say the Devils are the team of all the currently non-playoff teams in the East who you see them getting into the conversation? Is there anyone else we need to look out for?
Yeah, I think I would have the Devils first among the teams out, and then I would have Pittsburgh. I still think Pittsburgh is going to factor in. I don't know if they can do it, given the age of their core and all that. But look, they missed the playoffs, Pittsburgh, last year, by like a point or two on the last day of the season. So I think they're going to be right in the mix again. I think teams like Philadelphia and Washington will have a hard time outpacing them. But we'll see. I mean, that's kind of maybe where some of this lies. We'll see if Ottawa can climb back into it. They've dug a bit of a hole more than they would have liked to, but this hasn't fully taken shape yet. That's why I'm dubbing a few teams pretenders that are firmly in a spot as of this moment, because I just think there's a lot of hockey left to play.
Absolutely. But isn't this game so fun? Anyway.
I don't know.
To the Western Conference we go as CJ groans. The Central Division. We can speed through some of these contending teams. The Dallas Stars.
Contender.
The Colorado Avalanche.
Contender.
That was really good. The Winnipeg Jets.
Contender. I've been consistent on the Jets. I think that they were slept on a little bit. It's an uphill climb. I'm certainly not saying that they're an absolute top tier cup contender, but I think they're a playoff team, and they've shown it so far in the early goings of the season.
I wait with bated breath how long you debated over the Vegas Golden Knights.
I didn't have to think too much. Let's brand them. The champs are the champs until they're not the champs.
The Vancouver Canucks.
Contender. That was one I was wrong about from the start of the year, but I think we've seen enough that it doesn't look like smoke and mirrors to me in Vancouver, and I think absolute playoff contender, no doubt.
The Los Angeles Kings.
Contender. I mean, they're a team, right? They've come up against Edmonton in the last couple seasons and been beaten out in the playoffs. I think they're ready to take another step. It's hard not to notice, a player like Quentin Byfield, who's impacting the games to a degree he hasn't, previously at the NHL level. Yeah, I think that they've had like that internal growth. I think they'll be aggressive as the year goes on in terms of adding to their roster, and wouldn't surprise me at all to see them take the next step and have a longer playoff run than they have the last couple of years.
Okay. The St. Louis Blues.
They're my first pretender in the West. I'm not totally sold. I mean, give them credit. They played really well of late, and that's why they're in the playoff spot. But I just think when we get closer and closer to March 8th, we'll probably be talking about them maybe looking at trading a player or two, as they did last year at the deadline. I think that their philosophy internally has been they didn't want to bottom out. They've kind of they've kept some of the younger prospects not in the NHL lineup. They've acquired guys like Kasperi Kapanen and kind of like bridged the gap here. They're playing well, and you can't fault them for it. But I still think ultimately they're going to have trouble hanging into that spot right through to the end of the regular season.
Last one for you, the Seattle Kraken.
It hasn't looked good there this year. Who are the teams below the Kraken? Like immediately?
Immediately below the Anaheim Ducks, the Arizona Coyotes, the Calgary Flames, 4 points behind the Kraken. Then you have Nashville, Minnesota, Edmonton, Chicago, and San Jose.
Oh, Minnesota's surprising, isn't it? I think I'll say contender for Seattle, but I'm doing it with a small C. Like, I don't feel super confident about it, but I'm not looking at that list of teams and going like, well, they're not going to be able to hold off Team X. Very curious to see if there's a world where Minnesota can get it back on track. I don't know if they're maybe they're in Edmonton territory where they've just dug too big of a hole out of the gate. But I'm not super confident about the Kraken because it hasn't looked great this season. But I do think given that it's a very top heavy conference, I think that they're at least going to sneak into a wild card spot.
I'll say this though, just looking at the standings here, like to see Anaheim 3 points out of a playoff spot entering American Thanksgiving, good job on their part, and good job on Greg Cronin, who, if he finds a way to put this team into the playoffs, that's a guy who's going to get some Jack Adams love. I like what they're doing in Anaheim.
Yeah, and they've introduced younger players too, so it's coming in a way that I think that it's literally legitimately gives you hope for the future too. You're giving wins this season and hope for the future. I mean, that's ideal. I mean, Pavel Michikov probably not getting as much love as some of the other. I mean, we talk about Connor Bedard a lot and some of the other rookies around the league, but he's had a fantastic season on their blue line, forced their hand. He's sticking around. I'm with you. I think it's them in Arizona. I could see either of those teams could be surprises. Like I think they'll both hang around the playoff race. Maybe one of them gets hot enough to find a way to get in. Yeah, props to the Ducks who've turned it around pretty quickly after last year being very much in the Bedard sweepstakes until the end of the year. I mean, Leo Carlsson too. I mean, I know the thought there is they're not playing him in every game by design, sort of a load management situation, but he's going to be a star.
Yeah, it sure seems like he will. And that is going to do it for our fun little Thanksgiving game. You made it through another year where you tried to predict who would be in the playoffs rather than the playoffs. Wasn't that fun?
Yeah, it wasn't as painful as I was expecting. I mean, I guess ultimately it's pretty easy. The top five, give or take, on each side are, easy contenders, and then you got a couple calls to make. And so if you're a Caps fan and you're a Flyers fan, or who else did I mark down there?
You also
Seattle, St. Louis.
Seattle. I think also St. Louis. You mentioned them as a pretender as
well.
So
if you're a fan of those teams, you can jump in my mentions in 3 months' time if I was totally wrong and they actually hang around and make the playoffs.
Could be worse. You could be an Oilers fan looking at that list and thinking, "Oh no, we are nowhere near any small C contender status right now."
Yes.
Yeah. Jeez.
We've gone in enough on the Oilers. I got no more thoughts there other than, oh my goodness.